This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina.
And the Florence County Museum, announcing Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson Picturing Justice, organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum with support from Art Bridges. Johnson's evocative work is on view now through August 10th. FlocoMuseum.org.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. Few people beyond South Carolina's Low Country knew of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, Mother Emanuel, before the night of June 17, 2015, when a 21-year-old white supremacist walked into Bible study and slaughtered the church's charismatic pastor and 8 worshipers.
In his book, Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race Resistance and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Kevin Sack explores the inspiring history that brought the church to that moment and the depth of the desecration committed in its fellowship hall.
Sack reveals how African Methodism was cultivated from the harshest American soil, and how black suffering shaped forgiveness into both a religious practice and a survival tool. He uses the church's history to trace the long arc of black life in the city, where nearly half of enslaved Africans disembarked in North America and where the Civil War began. Kevin, I appreciate very much your coming up from Charleston to talk about your latest book, Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church.
It's such a privilege to be here with you, Walter.
Just a couple of things about who you are and who your folks. We all know you went to Duke, but where did you come from originally?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. I was born in 1959, spent my whole childhood there, then, went away to college at Duke, and then became a journalist, and my career took me first to the Atlanta Constitution. It was far enough ago that it was the Atlanta Constitution and not the Journal-Constitution back then. I then got hired by the New York Times, and with the exception of a 5-year interregnum that I spent at the Los Angeles Times, I spent about 30 years at the New York Times before retiring last October.
And you now live in Charleston.
I do. My wife and I moved there 2.5 years ago. We live downtown. We first came to Charleston for an extended period back in 2019 when I was doing research for the book, and I had taken a leave from my job at the New York Times to do that. And like everybody, I guess, we fell hard for the town. We had both spent significant time there before, but certainly fell hard for it then, and started looking for places to live. Didn't find one before the pandemic hit, and we kind of retreated back to Georgia where we were living. I wound up writing a good chunk of the book there, but then we came back to Charleston in 2022 and did find a place to live, and have been living there since and just love it.
All right, good. Was your first trip to Charleston right after the events at Mother Emanuel?
Well, I had spent a lot of time in Charleston, both as a journalist and as a tourist over the years, but I did come to Charleston immediately after the shootings. I got to town, I guess, 2 or 3 days later with the intent of writing a long profile of Reverend Pinckney, the pastor of the church, who obviously was killed that night. That story ran on the front page of the Times on the day of his funeral, the memorial service at TD Arena, and I then covered that service. So I was fortunate to be in the room when President Obama sang Amazing Grace.
So what determined you to write this particular book? It really is a history of an institution, Mother Emanuel, the oldest independent black church in the American South, traces its roots really back to colonial times. What made you determined to do that?
Well, that very night of the shootings, I'm embarrassed to say now, I'd never really heard of the church before then. And when the first broadcast came over CNN and they said that it was an African Methodist Episcopal Church, I have to say that my every worst jaded instinct sort of kicked in. And I assumed the worst, assumed that this was going to turn out essentially the way that it did, as a horrific hate crime. I started Googling literally that night to find out more about the church, and I just got transfixed by the history of the place. I mean, obviously, like everybody, I was deeply affected what was happening right then in real time, but at the same time, I was getting just fascinated by how rich the history was, how far back it went, that it was the first AME church in the South, that it was so closely tied to the Denmark-Vesey slave insurrection. It had this fascinating history during Reconstruction where the pastor who came south to sort of revive the congregation after the end of the Civil War, Richard Harvey Kane, wound up being one of the 16 African-American Southerners who were elected to Congress during Reconstruction. It had this significant civil rights history during the 50s and 60s. And I just got so interested in all of that and started to conceive of this notion that you could use the history of this one institution, this one congregation, to tell the broader story of African-American life in Charleston, which, let's face it, there may be no city in America that has a more significant African-American history than Charleston. You could use that one institution to tell that whole story sort of under one roof.
One thing you didn't mention is it was also the church of the black establishment.
Yes, it was. And one thing that I found early on, and that's obviously a theme throughout the book, was that the church really was founded by, and it was supported and sustained by, in its early days, by the free black community in Charleston. So the book gave me an opportunity to really dig into what that community was, how it came to be, and this unique role that it played in the city, both in developing this church and a black business infrastructure and social infrastructure.
Let's start back with that. The free black community was relatively large, at least at the beginning, several thousand. It was never as large as the one in New Orleans, but it was very influential. And this is a case of caste or class within race, as many of those free persons of color were of mixed race.
That's right, they were, and there were definitely caste differences. You know, those folks were in a very tenuous position. They were free and yet not free. Certainly, their activities were restricted in terms of occupations they could take on, in terms of where and how they could live, and the extent to which their movements were free and unregulated. But they certainly had all kinds of privileges that the enslaved population did not, obviously, and they had access to means. They could make money and save money, and so they were vital, obviously, to the creation of an institution that required financial means. They were the ones that bought the land. They were the ones that built the church, and there was a physical church that preceded the existing Mother Emanuel. In 1817, there was a mass walkout from Methodist churches by African-American members, led by a man named Morris Brown. Charlestonians may recognize that name. There's now a Morris Brown AME church on Morris Street. He's also the namesake of Morris Brown College in Atlanta. He was a free person of color. He was a shoemaker, so he did have some means. He was a property owner. And he also was a preacher, a lay preacher. And he led this walkout after a series of offenses, both in the governance of the church and the control of the church. The one that really broke the straw that broke the camel's back was when white members of the church decided to build a garage for their hearse over a black burial ground. And that's when the black membership said, that's it, we've had enough. And they left en masse. They created this church, built a congregation, built a physical church on the east side in the Neck at the corner of Hanover and Reed Street. And it lasted for 4 years until the Vesey Rebellion.
All right. It was a wooden structure.
Yep.
And one of the myths in the Mother Emanuel story is that it was burned after the Vesey. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, and I love the fact that you dig into the newspapers, you found an advertisement where the elders of the church dismantled it and sold the timbers. So it was It was not burned. It was closed. I had heard other accounts and read other accounts that it was physically destroyed by a white mob. It was closed, but the story was more complicated than that.
Yeah, I so wish I could take credit for that discovery, but I can't. The credit goes to Ethan Keitel, who, along with his wife, co-wrote Denmark Vesey's Garden a few years ago. And it's one of those wonderful historical discoveries that happened because of the digitization of newspapers. He was looking for anything that contained the phrase African church, and up popped this advertisement from Charleston's newspapers showing that the wood from the church would be sold at auction on this day in August. There were about a week's worth of ads that preceded the auction. And so it made clear that no, this building had not been burned. It had been dismantled board by board. And I think that certainly the conclusion that I reached based on the way the advertisement is worded and the fact that the lumber survived in the way it did is that I wouldn't be surprised if the members of the congregation themselves were given the task of taking this building down board by board. And can you imagine what a sad moment that had to be? It's admittedly it's not like watching your church go up in this conflagration, but to have to take this building apart that they had constructed themselves with their own hands, nail by nail, had to be a despairing moment in the history of that church.
Certainly by 1817, when the Black Methodists walk out, want to have their own house of worship. They do build it, but from the day it opened, the white authorities looked askance at it. And when the Vesey Rebellion, did it really happen? The historians are still debating that. Immediately, they linked the church with Denmark Vesey.
And to be clear, there's no real reason, there's no historical reason we know of for them to do that, right? We haven't found any evidence of that.
Well, what I found was a lot of direct association between those who were tried and convicted and membership in the church. And this was some of the more interesting original research that I think I did. I did a pretty deep dive into the numbers involved in the people that were tried and convicted and hung. And when you look at it, it's hard to not conclude that the church was itself a target of the investigation and the trials. There are 35 folks who were sent to the gallows as a result of the trial. Fully half of them had some sort of association with the church. They were members, they were trustees, some of them, or class leaders. Vesey himself was said to be a member of the church, although the evidence of that is fairly scant. And the only assertion of it is actually by the judges in the trial in their summary, as opposed to any recount of testimony by a witness.
Charleston, between 1817 and 1822, several things happened. One was the debate over Missouri and the question of expansion of slave plantation economy. In 1820, the census, South Carolina once again became a black majority state. You had those two things on the minds of the state's leadership, and then the Vesey case. I still, it was never actually a rebellion. The Vesey conspiracy, whatever you would like to call it.
Right.
And so what happens to that congregation between 1822 and 1865?
Well, you're right in sort of setting the scene as being one of this growing paranoia among the white population. They feel that their world is starting to collapse in on them to some extent, and they see all these threats everywhere they look. And needless to say, the Vesey insurrection, or at least the alleged plot, if we can call it that, only magnified that. And now it had come home to roost, right? It was in their backyards, and you could walk out the door and see the signs of it in terms of the militias marching and the increased police presence on the streets. So they were really feeling it, and you can sense that in the letters that we find in archives from folks that were alive at the time. The church was destroyed, and the leaders of the church were essentially exiled. Morris Brown and other ministers of the church were forced out of the state under threat of criminal prosecution. They left never to return. And there's really very little record of what happens for the next 40 years. The presumption is that some remnant of the church continued to exist, maybe in the parlors of houses or out in hush harbors, that there continued to be a practice of faith and a practice of worship during those years. But obviously, as the decades wore on, any sort of structure to it started to diminish.
Well, at least the Methodists and the Episcopalians and Presbyterians in the decade before the Civil War did create black chapels.
Yes, it's interesting. And the Methodists did not, perhaps because the memories of what had happened in the African church, the Emmanuel's predecessor, a Methodist congregation, were still so fresh. But yes, over time, other denominations in Charleston do start to create these sort of auxiliary churches for their black members, largely because physical space is needed at some point. The congregations just get too large and it's a way to split them off. Sometimes because there's already a distinction being created between black worship styles and white worship styles. And so there's a desire for separateness, but it's always within the confines of white control. These are not autonomous, independent congregations. They are African-American subsidiaries, basically, of white-owned and white-controlled institutions. And it's not until after the Civil War, obviously, that changes.
And there's supposed to be a white person there during the service.
By law.
That wasn't always the case. Sometimes the white person was not there, and there were black clergy or lay readers that took part in the service or led the services.
Indeed. I think in general, those churches did stay under pretty strict white control and monitoring. I'm sure there were times where there were exceptions. But in general, I think the white population knew what was going on in those black churches, and there was always pressure. You see letters in the newspapers from folks who are disturbed by what's happening in these churches, and so I think there was pressure on the white leadership of those congregations to maintain some control.
Well, let's go ahead and skip on up to 1865.
So in 1865, there are AME missionaries that essentially follow Union troops into Charleston, right behind, by a matter of days or weeks.
And basically the fountain of the AME Church is Philadelphia.
Yes, the AME denomination had been founded in Philadelphia in 1816 formally, although it was after a gestation of several decades. And Morris Brown and the founders of the African Church had quickly affiliated with that denomination. So there's a very clear connection from the earliest days of Emmanuel's predecessor to that denomination. And because of that, and also because the African Methodist Episcopal denomination had sent missionaries down to the Port Royal area during the Port Royal experiment to provide spiritual relief to the emancipated, formerly enslaved folks there, the denomination felt that it had sort of a rightful claim to the newly emancipated black population in the Low Country. And they weren't alone in that. There was competition. There was competition from the Northern Methodist Church, which was a white-controlled church. But they sent missionaries down. They made a very aggressive and hard play for the emancipated in the Low Country and were largely successful and quickly became the dominant denomination in that area. One of the most interesting characters that comes down at this point is Richard Harvey Kane, who had been a pastor in Brooklyn. He was given control of he was given charge of this mission to recreate a church in Charleston. He did so very quickly. A very dynamic leader, an expert fundraiser. And by the fall of 1865, this congregation has purchased a piece of property on Calhoun Street, which is where Emmanuel would be built and where it still is today.
and the competition with the Northern Methodists, it actually, their missionary chastised Cain and others as a church that was based on race.
That's right, which is really interesting. His name was Lewis, and he made the argument that specifically because the word African was in the name of the denomination, and because obviously the appeal was very directly to the formerly enslaved, that this was a race-based church, and that his denomination was not. And the response from the African Methodists, as you can imagine, was rather chilly, and they made the point directly to Lewis that the real difference here was that their church was governed by African Americans and would be governed by African Americans, and that the Northern Methodists, the white church, were nowhere near ready to accept that.
I find a lot of irony in that. All of that. Well, it's based on race. It's segregated.
That's right.
Okay.
Things change quickly.
Yeah.
Well, let's get Mother Emanuel built.
So it's constructed very quickly in over a year or two. It's a wood frame building, not the building that's on the site now, and the congregation continues to expand. New churches are seeded from that congregation, including Morris Brown and eventually Mount Zion.
And that's part of its name because it becomes the mother church for the AME denomination, not just in Charleston, but throughout the Low Country.
That's right. That's the source of the name. I mean, it is the first AME congregation to reform in the South. And when you look at the concentration of AME churches in South Carolina, and particularly in the Low Country and sort of up the Highway 17 corridor, is just remarkable. You can drive up and down that road from Charleston, and you just see one AME church or chapel after the next, and many of them date back to that period of time.
And in fact, that first church, I think, seated 1,500 people.
It did, packed into the rafters, That church lasted until the early 1890s. Another one of the sort of legends about Mother Emanuel has always been that the church was flattened by the earthquake of 1886. It wasn't. I was able to find some documentation in the Charleston County Public Library that it was still standing. There was some damage. A window was broken. I think the organ had been smashed. There was a dusting of dirt everywhere, but it was still standing, and in fact was used immediately after for funerals of some of the deceased in the earthquake. That earthquake was just a remarkable event, and there's a fantastic summary of it from Norman Bascom Sterrett, who was a former pastor of Emanuel, went on to become the founding pastor of Mount Zion AME. And he's watching the whole thing from his front porch in Somerville. And he remarks about the sudden turn towards religiosity by all the people in the streets who he never saw in church, but now figure that their only chance is to get down on their knees and pray.
And of course, in Somerville, that was the epicenter.
That was the epicenter.
And of course, the fact that it was a wooden building is one reason it survived.
Right.
But then shortly thereafter, we have the Great Hurricane.
It gets struck again by this enormous storm, and the building is becoming compromised. It's already too small to hold its congregation, and the congregation is splitting here and there. So at that point, Sterrett, the pastor, does decide that it's time to build a new building. In fact, he decides that they're going to go both routes. They're going to split the congregation, and that's at the point at which Mount Zion AME is formed. But they're also going to construct a brand new building for Emanuel on the existing site. And that work starts around 1891.
It's masonry. Later it would be covered with stucco, but it's masonry. Again, it's going to be large, thinking of 1,500 or more.
That's right. And it was the original plans called for it to be a wood building, and the bishops of the church, it was essentially a national decision, to make it a masonry building because they wanted it to represent the permanence of the faith, and they wanted it to be something of a monument to African Methodism in the South. So it was originally built in brick. There are some fantastic pictures of the way it looked before it was stuccoed. It didn't get stuccoed until the 1940s. And so now it's got this shiny white sheen to its exterior.
Making this a brick structure raised the cost, which the locals ended up paying for.
That's right, although they also solicited funds from African Methodists nationwide. I think once the bishops decided that this building needed to be of brick and not of wood, the leaders of the church decided, well, if that's the case, it's the denomination's obligation to pitch in. And there were solicitations to African Methodists around the country to send in $1 and buy a brick.
So the physical structure there, both interior and exterior, is pretty much what was erected in the 1890s.
Yes, the building is very much the same now as it was then, particularly when you go inside. There's still oil lamps, no longer functional, but still there. The oaken pews and the floors are original. With every creak in the floor, you feel that connection back to the 1890s.
And at that time, the basement, the site of the tragedy in June 2015, was unfinished.
That's right, and wasn't really finished for quite a while. It was finally did get finished with linoleum flooring and wood paneling. It was nothing fancy down there, and it remains that way. It's essentially unchanged from the night of the massacre.
Well, we earlier said that Mother Emanuel was a church of the black establishment, and the AME denomination is in many ways relatively conservative. It's not until the 20th century that through a series of pastors, beginning with the Reverend Glover and others, that the church, at least some of the church leadership, becomes much more active in terms of civil rights in the community.
Yeah, my research showed that the hierarchy of the church, and when I say that, I'm really talking about the bishops of the church, who are all powerful, for a lot of years did not take the sort of aggressive stance against Jim Crow that you might have expected them to. They referenced it. They put out statements. They encouraged change, but it was relatively mild given the size of the denomination. And I think, yes, by the time the 50s arrive, there are pastors in individual churches who are out ahead of the denomination itself.
Well, you mentioned two turn-of-the-century visitors, and they were the polar opposites in the black community. You've got Booker T. Washington and his philosophy of uplift within the community, not challenging Jim Crow head-on, and W.E.B. Du Bois, both of whom had the pulpit at Mother Emanuel, not at the same time, but separately.
Right. They both spoke at the church, and I make the argument that members of the congregation could essentially experience that whole ideological span of black resistance thinking just by sitting in the pews and watching the speakers who came to the pulpit. Washington delivered a long address about the importance of education and industrial education, which obviously was the whole foundation behind Tuskegee, and made a point of talking about the need for African Americans in the South to get along with their white neighbors, that this was the most help they could get, the best thing they could do for themselves would be to essentially to be acquiescent and not challenging of the status quo. Du Bois, we don't have a record of exactly what he said in Charleston. Interestingly, there was no newspaper coverage of his talk. There was advertising of the fact that it was about to happen. But if we look at the things that he was saying at the same time, it could not have been, a more different approach. And the two of them obviously were antagonists at this point. He was in a phase where he was promoting Pan-Africanism, this notion that the same sort of oppression and discrimination that we saw in the United States was a worldwide global phenomenon, and that it had to be treated as such. So yes, their messages were very distant from each other.
And of course, there is a long-time connection between the AME Church and the AME Church in Liberia. right after the Civil War, there was an exodus promoted, and the linkages, particularly with African Americans in the city of Columbia more than in Charleston, but there is that church link the country.
And let's remind people what Liberia is, briefly.
Liberia was established as a new nation in Africa to take formerly enslaved persons and help them leave the United States. The center of this activity were the border states like Maryland. We may not like slavery. Okay, well, what are you going to do if they're freed? Well, let's ship them back to Africa.
But yes, there was certainly a movement among some AME leaders to go back to Africa, certainly as Reconstruction started to fail. Richard Harvey Kane was very much an advocate for a while.
All right, and within the denomination, there was always a tension between a more staid service and a more spiritual experience that, particularly in the low country of South Carolina, regardless of denomination, African Americans worship God.
Right. And I think you see a variety of worship styles even within the Low Country's African Methodist churches, depending on their age and where they are and the various characteristics of the membership. Some places it's very conservative. Emmanuel is one of those places, but other places you can find being a little more boisterous. So it's not uniform, but in general, African Methodism, I would argue, certainly socially, has been very conservative in both its worship practices and its theology and its politics.
Well, at one point you referred to the worship in Mother Emmanuel as high church,
right?
Methodism.
As a presiding elder told me, drums came in late there. That was sort of looked down upon for a while. There's still no electric guitar. And the preaching style, I think, is very straightforward. The membership is old and getting older. It's been very hard for them to attract younger members, which is sort of interesting. The church really was, to some extent, a church in decline and a church with a lot of challenges at the time that the shootings happened, suffering a lot of the woes that other African-American churches in downtown Charleston have suffered, largely as a result of gentrification, right? Emmanuel used to be a neighborhood church. Everyone lived around it and then walked there on Sunday mornings or took a short bus ride. Now, most of the membership cannot afford to live anywhere near the church because of the skyrocketing prices of real estate and taxation in downtown Charleston. So they've moved to North Charleston. They've moved to West Ashley. Some of them have found more convenient churches to go to. So it's been a real challenge to keep the membership numbers up.
Well, let's go back, and we talked about Du Bois and Washington, but the activism that began in the church with the church leadership, again, not always with the full support of the congregation, leading up to the Civil Rights Movement, where Mother Emmanuel was clearly key in the Charleston movement.
Right. It was, and that was largely because of the role played by Benjamin J. Glover, who was the longest-serving pastor of the church. He started there in 1952 and served until 1965, I believe I'm right about that. And Glover was a remarkable figure. He had been born in the Due West area and had been able to go away to college. He was the son of an AME preacher, so it was in his blood. Came from a large family. He went to Wilberforce in Ohio for college and came back and immediately got himself in trouble trying to register to vote, was beaten badly as a result of that. By the time he got to Charleston, he was a fully evolved civil rights activist and began to use Emmanuel as a staging point for demonstrations, for marches, for boycotts. Protest signs were drawn and painted in the basement. There were kids who stayed behind to make bologna sandwiches for those who came back to have lunch. And in no uncertain words, it scared the hell out of a lot of the congregation. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham had been bombed. 4 little girls had been killed in that assault. And the people in Charleston had no reason to think that the same thing wouldn't happen at Emmanuel, a church that they had invested their time in, their money in, and that they considered a refuge.
You actually quote a letter that he got protesting.
Yeah, he would get letters from members of the congregation. The one that I quote in the book was anonymous, which is interesting, warning him that he needed to back off, that it was dangerous, and that he was going to wind up paying a price.
Well, you also cite a letter that Judge Wadis Waring, who's no longer in South Carolina, wrote him, chastising him and the black community.
That was one of the most fascinating finds. I came across it in a folder where you wouldn't expect to find it at the Avery Research Center in Charleston. The background is that Glover, who was both the pastor at Emmanuel and the branch president of the Charleston NAACP, had invited Waring to come back to Charleston to deliver a speech. It's not clear from Glover's letter which hat he was wearing, whether it was as the NAACP president or the pastor of the church. But he extends this invitation, and the two men knew each other. Waring and his wife Elizabeth had at this point decamped for New York. They felt unwelcome in Charleston, both for social reasons and because he had become so recognized as a civil rights supporting jurist. And Waring writes this amazing letter back, turning down the invitation. He starts off by explaining that his wife is not well, and therefore any travel is out of the question. But then you can almost hear him sort of clearing his throat and taking a breath and saying, but there's another reason I'm not coming. And here it is. And he just blisters Glover. I don't know whether Glover bore any personal responsibility that merited this, but he uses Glover sort of as a catch-all target, I guess, to complain about the unwillingness and the slowness of the African-American community in Charleston, and primarily the NAACP in South Carolina, for not sort of taking advantage of the openings that he's offered them with his pro-civil rights rulings, particularly, obviously, the Briggs case and that led to the desegregation of the state schools.
Well, I found that letter absolutely, oh gosh. I took a deep breath and thought, oh my God.
It's withering, right? I mean,
yes, it really, frankly, it irritated me because Glover was already putting himself on the line.
Right.
And I'm sorry, no matter what Wadis Waring had done, he's safely in New York.
Right.
And it's easy for him to say, you've got to be more active.
Right. Yeah, he couldn't possibly understand or feel the pressures that somebody like Glover was under. And I think his frustration was more general. I doubt that it was aimed at Glover in particular, who, like you said, was he was out on the streets every day with a sandwich board around his neck that protested white supremacy. So he was out in public as a target, and he was a target. There were phone calls to the house. He spent any number of nights in jail.
The way he protested, he would stand outside the local Piggly Wiggly or the Belk's department store or whatever and take down the names of African Americans who shopped there.
Right.
His sign would say, they don't hire any African Americans, they don't even hire janitors or certainly not sales clerks or what have you. You shouldn't be spending your money there.
Right.
And if a black person basically crossed his picket line, he told everybody who they were.
That's right. He was convinced of the power of the pocketbook in the civil rights cause, and he felt that boycotts, controlling where the African American community spent its money, would ultimately be the strategy that was effective. And to a large extent, he was right about that. And yes, he was relentless in marshaling his own community to this cause. And it was not beneath him to call out his own members in church for having crossed the picket line.
And I wonder how they how they felt about going to church, knowing that was a possibility.
They probably didn't show up the next Sunday. Yeah.
I'm thinking.
He filled a water gun with black ink.
Yes. And sprayed it at the back of folks that would cross his line, so that they were literally marked men and women.
Oh, okay. Well, we're talking now about the 60s, so the civil rights movement is in full swing in the South, even in South Carolina. And Mother Emanuel, as you point out, is a headquarters in Charleston for protesters. This is also the time of jail, no bail.
Which started in Rock Hill, right?
Yeah, but it spread, and Reverend Glover practiced that, got himself arrested. He also took young people from Charleston to Columbia. They had the March on the State House that ended up in a Supreme Court case.
That's right, the Edwards case. He was arrested along with now Congressman Clyburn and numerous others for what was a totally peaceful and ultimately, it was determined, legal demonstration on the Capitol grounds. And that case wound up prompting a challenge that went all the way to the Supreme Court, an important ruling that said once and for all that as long as demonstrations are peaceful and that crimes are not being committed in the course of that demonstration, they are constitutional. Glover, it's interesting, went back with other civil rights leaders immediately after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which opened up all public accommodations, or were intended to. They had gone to the Sumter Hotel down on the Battery,
Fort Sumter
Hotel, a year or two before, and had gotten arrested for trying to be served. Now the law was on their side, and they went back. And the manager of the hotel agreed to seat his two colleagues, but declined to seat him, and explained to him that this was not because of his race. He just didn't find him a suitable person to sit in his dining room. So B.J. Glover did not make many friends in the white community during the civil rights movement, and even after the movement, they had long memories.
Mother Emanuel, you mentioned earlier, post-civil rights at the time we're talking about in the early 21st century is a church in decline, and gentrification has had part of that. But there were also internal issues, nothing serious, but young people seemed to be going somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that had a lot to do with the style of worship. It was pretty set in its ways. As I mentioned before, the music is pretty traditional. There's not a lot of sort of new Christian music that you might hear in a megachurch or in a non-denominational church. The music's not as necessarily as rocking, I guess I would say. And the preaching style is somewhat the same. The membership is quite old and probably getting older. It makes it very hard to attract younger members. And the church has also got real structural issues. They're in the middle now of a two-phase fundraising campaign to try to raise the money they need to repair very severe damage caused by termite infestation and water damage over the years. Real financial challenges for this congregation with, again, a small membership to find a way to handle those challenges. And there's, in addition to the money that's being raised to solve their structural problems, there's a separate campaign going on to build a memorial next to the church to the Emanuel Nine and to the 5 survivors. So to some extent, they're competing for the same pots of money.
Well, before we get to the Emanuel Nine, the church is very much in decline, and then the Reverend Pinckney becomes the pastor.
Yes, and he's a remarkable figure, obviously, for the church because of his stature. I mean, he was the youngest African-American ever elected to South Carolina's legislature. At the time of his death, he was a 4-term state senator. So there was a lot about him that appealed to this congregation. You know, he had the standing and the reputation that they like to see in a pastor. I think his own standing enhanced their standing. But at the same time, he was a man who was torn between numerous responsibilities and all over the state. So he was driving back and forth between his district, which was south of Charleston, largely.
It's the largest senatorial district in South Carolina.
It is the largest district in the state. And so he was ping-ponging, back and forth between that district, the capital in Columbia, his home outside of Columbia, and Charleston for church events. And at the time of the shootings, there was some real concern within the congregation, and I would say growing concern, about his lack of presence at the church. He was there on Sundays, often was not there during the week. Meetings had to be scheduled with him. He wasn't the kind of pastor where you could just sort of walk in the door. And there was substantial grumbling about that in the congregation.
And that tragic event in June, 10 years ago, this month, changed a lot of things. You devote several chapters to the changed atmosphere, fame of Mother Emanuel, and also the city of Charleston, based upon what is forgiveness.
Well, the place can never be the same, I think. It's forever marked. You can't be inside the building and not feel it. I write in the book that when I would sit in my usual pew on Sunday mornings, it was hard not to look across the aisle at Sharon Coakley and Blondell Gadsden and not remember them as the sisters of one of the deceased victims, or to lean back over the pew and gossip with Willie Glee and not realize that he was only there because he had gotten hungry that night and decided to go out for a bite to eat and had skipped Bible study. So you can't really escape it. I think that the church is doing its best to try to, not really to move on. It's important to the congregation and the leadership to always remember and to commemorate what happened. But there's also obviously a striving for normalcy that I think will be in play for a number of years. And yes, the church, both locally and internationally, has become known for this forgiveness narrative that took place after the shootings. Everyone remembers that on the 2 days after the murders, there was a bond hearing for the remorseless killer, and that one after the next, 5 different family members of the victims got up and expressed some degree of forgiveness for this guy. Many people saw that as sort of the purest expression of Christianity they had ever experienced. It really shook the world. It moved people profoundly. And as a result, Emanuel gained this reputation, and Charleston, both through that event, through the hand-holding march across the bridge the weekend after the shootings, through President Obama's eulogy, through all of those things, became known as sort of a place of forgiveness. And I spend a considerable amount of time in the book trying to assess what that really was about, the forgiveness that was expressed towards Dylann Roof, and trying to place it in the context of centuries of Black experience and in the context of the Black church. And I wind up concluding that I think those who saw it as sort of the, an earnest prayer for the soul of this remorseless killer may have misunderstood its intent. That I think it really was more true to a very self-protective, almost survival tactic that African American Christians have adopted over the centuries that have allowed them to survive first enslavement and then this intense discrimination and the devolution of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the lynchings, the hangings, the shooting of a man in the back in North Charleston by a police officer, and ultimately the killing of 9 faithful parishioners in the fellowship hall of a church.
You also mentioned, in terms of the philosophy of forgiveness, it puts you in the position of power. And some of those folks were telling Dylann Roof, I'm stronger than you are. I'm in the position to do this. And of course, that was 180 degrees from what he thought and believed.
That's exactly right. It was an expression of agency, right? You reclaim your power against your victimizer by telling him that he's not going to control the rest of your life. I've got a quote in the book from Anthony Thompson, who was the widower of Myra Thompson, who was killed, saying that what it did for him, what forgiveness did for him, and he was one of those who spoke at the bond hearing, was that it freed him of Dylann Roof forever, that he was not going to make a lifetime partner of his wife's killer, and that the ability to forgive put him on that path.
Well, you quote Dylann extensively, what he said in court, which is still chilling to read. And you can't jokingly say, well, blame it on the internet, but that was the source of the venom that he imbibed.
He blames it on the internet. I exchanged a couple of letters with him in jail. They were disturbing and chilling. Still no sign of remorse whatsoever. In fact, he asserts that he doesn't think he should be seen as a bad guy. He's clearly just very detached from the reality of what he did and the severity of it and the incredible amount of pain that he left behind, not only for the families of his victims, but for his own family too. I also was able to submit an open records request for audio recordings of his non-privileged communications with family members while he was in the Charleston County Detention Center. And I got back about 10 or 11 hours worth of conversations between him and his mother, him and his grandparents. And they're very cautious. They know that these conversations are being recorded and that if he says the wrong thing, it can be used against him. But what really comes across is just how unaffected he is, not only by his own plight, but by theirs. He has no appreciation whatsoever for the pain that he's caused them and the way that he's ripped apart his own family, despite the fact that these folks are continuing to support him and be there for him and care for him.
The national media coverage was incredible from that fateful night through the memorial service held there at the College of Charleston in the arena to Governor Haley promoting taking down the flag from the Confederate monument to the tremendous amount of money that came into the church, which then caused issues as well.
It did. The money just flowed in. Almost immediately. I interviewed the church secretary at the time, and she talked about going back to the church. I guess it was the first Monday or Tuesday after the shootings, and there's a mail slot in the front door of the church on the Calhoun Street side, and there's sort of a locked box on the inside portion of it, and it was so stuffed filled with envelopes and just cash and coins that the top sprung open, she said, when she took the lock off. And, there's no way to prepare for an event like this, for a terrorist attack in your church fellowship hall. And among the ways they were not prepared was the accounting for and distribution of this money that came in. It just was not something they could anticipate, and they had no staff to really handle it. And as a result, the process was confusing, and it wasn't very well monitored, and there were accusations that that money intended for one pot wound up in another pot. In other words, that there might be an envelope addressed to the victims of the shootings or the families of or something like that, and that money was being taken out of envelopes sort of willy-nilly and put into piles and didn't necessarily get to where it was intended.
And the secretary raised the issue and she got fired.
She got fired. There was never any demonstration of cause and effect. She filed suit over her firing, claiming that it was because she blew the whistle. The suit wound up being settled out of court, so we don't have any sort of legal determination on that issue. At the same time, the Charleston Post and Courier ran a series of stories about financial problems in past pastoral appointments held by the new pastor, the interim pastor, Reverend Norville Goff, who had been the presiding elder in the district and was then given charge of Mother Emanuel in the immediate aftermath. So that also cast some shadows and cast some doubt. All of it was very difficult for the church to recover from. And obviously, as time went by and the church is trying to raise money both for this memorial and for these internal repairs, made it a really tough task when you've got, at one point, a SLED investigation going on into their fundraising activities as they're trying to
and for our folks who are not South Carolinians, it's South Carolina Law Enforcement Division.
Yes, exactly. The state police.
Yeah, the state's FBI,
right.
if you will. And it was almost a revolving door in terms of who had the pulpit. And that was a question of leadership by the national denomination.
Yeah, there's really no good explanation for it. But at a time when this church needed stability above all, they went through a revolving door of pastors. Obviously, Reverend Pinckney was killed in the tragedy. Reverend Goff was appointed to replace him and served for roughly, 6 months. He was then replaced by Betty Dees Clark, who was appointed by the bishop to fill that role. First woman pastor in the church's history. And a lot of people saw that as a really valuable asset, that she was a motherly figure at a time when the church needed some tender-hearted care and some outreach. She wound up being ousted by the same bishop who appointed her roughly 6 months after the appointment. And it had to do with her decision to go to Orlando to speak in support of the victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting. At that point, the pastor of Emanuel had essentially become, by default, a spokesman against gun violence. And she felt an obligation to go. The bishop preferred that she not go. She was supposed to instead be at a White House conference that he wanted her at. They didn't communicate so well. She wound up going. He got very upset about it. And in an interview with me, he acknowledged that among the things he was upset about was that by going to Orlando and associating herself with the cause of the victims in that shooting, she was, in essence, putting herself and her congregation on the record in support of gay rights in this country, and that might be a step too far for her congregation. That was a real testament, I thought, to sort of the social conservatism of this denomination, which persists. And the African Methodists have a very sort of uncomfortable relationship with the whole issue of same-sex marriage, for instance.
Okay, where is Mother Emanuel today in 2025?
I think it has stabilized. The first couple of years were so tumultuous because of the fundraising questions, because of the constant changes in leadership. They've now got a pastor who has been there since 2016 and I think does have a firm grip on the congregation. And they're kind of back to, being church and running through their annual schedule of events. I think it's still very challenging for them to get members, but I do think it's moving forward and trying to get the building in better structural condition. An interesting phenomenon, obviously, is that it's no longer just a church, it's a shrine as well. And so on Sunday mornings, a sizable chunk of the folks in the pews are visitors. It's a gradual process at Emanuel, but I think 10 years later, I think most of the congregation now is accustomed to the fact that they're going to have to share their church with the world. And I think for the most part, they do graciously, and they're happy to see the visitors who let's face it, provide, a certain amount of life to the church.
Security is still tight, understandably so.
Mm-hmm. It is. I opened the book by quoting, every preacher who's ever preached, talking about how the doors of the church are always open. And these days I find that unfortunately the doors of the church are not always open, and understandably so. And that's at Emmanuel and other churches around the Low Country that I've spent time at the last decade. I heard from two of the trustees at Emmanuel, two men that became good friends over time, that they were watching me on one of my first visits to the church. It must have been 3 or 4 weeks after the shootings probably. And I was up in the gallery, and they were in the choir loft, and they both watched as I opened my black canvas work bag, which was large enough to conceal a hidden weapon. And they sort of breathed a sigh of relief when I only took out my laptop. And it was a chilling story to hear, obviously, because it reminded me and reinforced to me that, to some extent, I look like the guy that walked into that church and killed 9 people, and therefore there is a natural instinct to suspect me, or to at least, want to check me out a bit. But that hasn't changed. There's the doors are now locked. There are security cameras, and there are also members of the congregation who have been trained to provide security, and they are carrying firearms in the house of the Lord.
All right, Kevin, I hate to say this, but Alfred is giving the wind-up sign. So any last words for our listeners before we sign off today?
I guess the only thing I would add, Walter, other than my deep thanks again for taking the time to talk about the book, is to stress that I think this history is so important. It's a self-interested argument, obviously, but I think, every South Carolinian, at least, if not every American, needs to understand the cycle of oppression and resistance that is African American history in a place like Charleston and a place like the South. And I'm not in any way trying to be partisan here, but our ability to tell this history is now under direct assault. And I guess I would just encourage listeners to make sure that even the inglorious chapters of American history get told fully and fairly.
Well, you chronicle not just the history of the church. You chronicle the history of Charleston and South Carolina. And as I've said many times on the Journal, this is all part of our history. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate you having me.
Thank you for joining our conversation today. The white supremacist who walked into the Bible study at Mother Emanuel 10 years ago had targeted that church, hoping to agitate the racial strife in Charleston and beyond. What resulted from the killings instead was an outpouring of forgiveness from victims' families and a reckoning with the caste divisions that have afflicted Charleston and the South since the earliest days of European settlement.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at All Good Books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.